Good afternoon. Welcome to UT Brainstorms. Thank you for being here. So we like to do a few things before we get started. So one of my favorites is to ask, raise your hand if this is your first time at a UT Brainstorms. Okay. Wow. So second question, how many of you heard about it through social media? Yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Since there's so many newcomers, let me give you our standard introduction and spiel. So my name is Mike Mock. I'm the chair of the department in the neuroscience, and the department sponsors UT Brainstorms, and the idea is we just felt a few years ago that a world-class neuroscience department should be a good member of their community and reach out and share with non-scientists what we're up to and why we think it's important and what it might mean for our lives. Because after all, there's probably no scientific discipline that's more about ourselves than neuroscience. And so we have UT faculty. We've had this season, this is our third season. We had a couple of outside faculty. Full disclosure, they were friends of mine. But we're branching out a little, but today we're back home, and we're using one of our own today to speak. So let me tell you a little bit about the idea. So we have a conversation in the title for a reason. So it's our sincere goal that that not only will you hear from us and about us, about neuroscience, but you'd be surprised how much we learn and grow from talking to you and listening to your questions and thinking about what's important to you. So it's very much intended as a two-way conversation. There's a lot of people here today, and so not everybody's going to get to ask a question in the end. So I want to say that if you leave here and haven't had a question answered, you email me. The email will be up here later, chair of the department or mock@utexas.edu. Either way, you email me and we'll find a way to get your question answered. Okay. Now, I want to take a couple of seconds to brag a little bit. So each year, the College of Natural Sciences presents an award for outreach excellence, and this year, the award went to our three staff who helped make this happen, and it's a plaque and some monetary prize. And so I want to acknowledge Elena. Elena, are you? Okay, she's probably working. Elena Silva, who's here. Alma Vasquez, who still works for the department, but she's off-site now. There she is. Award-winning Elena Silva. Yay. And Laura and Ian, our department manager, the three of them won. And so they do a lot of work for this, as you can imagine. Yeah. And it's nice that they get acknowledged that, the work they put in to make this happen. So thank you for that. So last thing about our procedure here. So we've switched to a new system. So we'll be taking questions via text. So we subscribe to a service, and towards the end of the presentation, there'll be a phone number that you can text. Your questions will go to that computer, and our panel members will select the ones, and somehow they end up over on this computer, and then Elena will be advancing through, and we'll be asking questions that way. So, and then I've already been scolded by a couple of people. So if you don't have a phone and would like to ask a question, you raise your hand and I'll find you, and we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so today's speaker, Marisa Toups, is an assistant professor in the Dell Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry. And she was here as a panelist maybe 5 or 6 brainstorms ago and did so well that we thought, that makes sense. And so now we're excited to hear what she has to talk about today. Our other panel member that I'll introduce to you when the time comes is also from Dell Psychiatry, and so it's a Psychiatry Day. So I would, just to get things moving along and skip the long introductions that academics don't really like anyway, please join me in welcoming Professor Marisa Toups.
Hello, thank you guys all for coming. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between physical and mental health, which may not be a very surprising topic for a psychiatrist, because that's sort of the training I had, where I went through 4 years of medical school where we spent a lot of time talking about the body, and then I went through 4 years of residency where we spent a lot of time talking about the mind. And ultimately, my research has ended up right in the intersection of those two things, and I'm going to try to lead you guys down the path of that story. So, what is the relationship between the brain and the body? So, most of us, if you were a child in the 80s like I was, you will know where this picture is from. If not, it is a picture of Krang, who is a villain from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon that used to be on Saturday mornings. And so you can see he's like a little brain, and he drives this big body. And snarls and makes trouble. And so we usually think of our brains as sort of being like that, like it's a little guy who's in the driver's seat of our body and it's telling our body what to do. And we see if its function is primarily to make decisions for the rest of us. But of course, our brains are actually completely networked in with the rest of our body through the rest of the nervous system. And this is actually a old dissection that an anatomist did in the late 19th century. One of the first full, complete nervous systems dissections. So you can see how many, just feet and feet of nerves you have. And so what is your brain doing with all of those connections besides just telling your body what to do? So in addition to our sensation, so we think about sight, sound, or tactile sensation, we actually have neurons that go to all of the rest of our body, and they collect information from them. So that includes these little tiny organs here, the heart, the respiratory system, stomach, and all of that information feeds back up into the brain. And not just information literally that's like tactile or sensate information, but information about the function of all of those organs, right? So are my intestines moving? How much air is coming into my lungs? What is my heart rate? Things like that. And that information is processed in the brain. And so we call that sensation interoception, so it's a sense of your body's function. And this is a word that has not at all penetrated into the public consciousness as far as I can tell. I only learned about it in the last few years when I started doing research in this area. But it's extremely important because it's the foundational sensation of our emotional lives. As far as we can understand it, and I'll talk about the brain circuits in a minute, our ancestors evolutionarily literally grew the brain region that in humans that makes our emotions from the brain region whose job it was to feel how our bodies were doing and what they were doing. So they're deeply related even in human beings. And we're going to talk about how that works. So neuroscientists don't think of feelings the same way that most of us do. There's actually a couple models, full disclosure, not everyone agrees with this model. This is the model that I like. This is what they call the model of constructed emotion. And so in this model, we think of the brain as having sort of two dimensions in which it determines how you're feeling. And those two are valence and arousal. So valence means whether something is good or bad. This is positive or negative. And arousal is just literally how alert you are. So the lowest arousal state is you're asleep. High arousal states are you're running around or you're very active, and then you feel either positive or negative. And so all of your feelings are somewhere in this grid. So your brain activity is falling somewhere in this grid, and that is how you feel at any moment. So what we normally call emotions are those feelings plus a context, which means that emotions don't exist out in the world. They exist because we name them and we call them. So there was a long time when most people believed that human emotions were universal. And so this theory is sort of counter to that, to say they're not universal, that you have to understand the context in which a person is functioning to understand what the emotion is. And so, for example, if you look at, I know this is a blurry picture, but if you look at a woman's face, you're like, well, is she afraid? Is she excited? What's going on, right? So if we don't know the context she's in, we can't accurately state what her emotion is. And even for us, if we don't know what context we were in, we wouldn't know how to state what our emotions are either. So if you think about like right now, like before I get up to give a talk, am I excited or am I nervous? Who knows, right? It depends on what I decide, right? So I can tell myself I'm excited instead of nervous. And I have to have some sort of sense of what's going on around me to make that decision for myself. So in this model, then all of our feelings are, we name these sort of points on this grid. So if you have high arousal but it's positive, that's excitement. If you have high arousal and it's negative, it could be terror or rage. And then you have some things that are low arousal, like feeling hopeless is a negative state, that's low arousal. Feeling calm, somewhere kind of in the middle. And so we name all of these as humans, and then we say these are emotional states. And so even though they are somewhat culturally determined, because we are such social and emotional animals as we grow up through our lives, we learn these names and they become really integral to how we understand ourselves and how we behave. So to go back to our girl, if we understand that she's on a roller coaster, which is where I got this picture, then we can get a little more sense that she's probably excited. Although, of course, it's still possible that she's terrified, depending on how she feels about roller coasters. So, well, she looks more, in this picture, she looks more like she's excited, right? So, and so if you think about sort of the next level of complexity up from emotions, which is just how you feel plus the context you're in, then we would think about mood. And so mood is how you feel and how you think you're gonna feel for the indeterminate future. And so what that means is you're trying to guess how well you're gonna be able to meet all your needs in the future. And so it doesn't depend on just like I'm on a roller coaster right now. It depends on understanding things about yourself, like I'm with a bunch of my friends who also like they like roller coasters, and so I should like roller coasters too. And so for other things that we do, it depends on maybe like what resources we have or what our goals are. And I'm going to talk more about this in some detail. But usually when I talk about mood, I like to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he was a sort of famous psychologist who came up with this idea of this is how human beings organize their psychological and physical needs. So at the bottom, people need literally the things that keep us alive: air, food, water. You also need sleep. And so then above that are things that help you do these in a consistent way. So like having housing, for example, keeps you safe. Then you need social relationships. Then you need to have some self-esteem, understanding that you've achieved things. And then at the very top are these sort of more abstract ideas like I'm going to be a, expert in psychiatry and neuroscience, or my self-actualization. And so when you think about mood, is like when you're in a good mood, you're like, yeah, I got this down, right? Like you don't have any questions. You know that you're going to be able to do this stuff. And as long as you're sort of looking up the pyramid, your mood is good. And if you're looking down the pyramid, like you're worried you might lose your house, then your mood is not going to be good. So this is going to be the most complicated part. And every time I try to talk about this, I redo my slides like 100 times. And so y'all get to try out the newest version of my slides. So we're going to talk about how all of this influences how organisms behave. And for this section, we're going to have my little mouse is going to be our example. So she has a lot of different things that she could choose to do, right? So how do you choose what to do when you get up in the morning? In this case, our mouse has a goal, a dream in life, that she wants to find a nice male mouse and have some little mouse babies. That's what she wants. So how does she decide to organize her day to reach her goal? So she's going to get up in the morning. She's like, okay, I'm going to eat some cheese. I'm going to, clean myself off. I'm going to spend most of my effort looking for a mate. And then if I find a mate, then I'll get to do these other tasks that I really are my real goals, but they're not in reach today. Then if I don't find a mate or whatever, then I'll go back to my burrow at night and I'll rest. So she has her day all planned out. And because she has her day all planned out and she thinks she can do it, she's in a very good mood. So then suppose she gets up, she takes her little mouse shower, And then she's like, darn, I'm out of cheese. It sucks. Like, she's upset. So she has to go looking for food, and she thought that was going to be easy, and it's not easy anymore, right? So she has to spend a lot of effort on seeking food. And so that is going to make her whole plan of spending her time seeking a mate more difficult than she anticipated, right? And so her mood now is not as good because she thought she had it all handled, and she does not. So we call this, from like a neuroscience perspective, when things happen the way you don't expect, to be expectation error. So, so sometimes what happens is a small thing, and you're kind of a little bit of a bad mood, and then sometimes things go really wrong, right? So the bigger the mismatch between what we think is going to happen when we wake up in the morning and what actually does happen, and the more that we see that projecting forward in time, the worse our mood is. And if we anticipate that it's going to take a whole lot of work to get things back down to the anticipated plan, then we're really in a bad mood. So if you are in a position where you think you might lose your job or lose your house or lose some major crisis, and you know that that's going to happen in the future, but you don't have a plan to prevent it, then that's the kind of thing that causes us to have the worst mood of all, right? So, how do our brains know what we're feeling? The part of the brain that is responsible for helping us know what we're feeling is called the insula. And it's called that, yes, because it's inside on the brain. So it's part of the cortex, but it's in the inside of the main fold in the brain surface. And it is the part of the brain that is responsible for interoception. So the point of this little diagram is to understand that it takes information from the body. That's the green arrow. And then it also gets information from things that are going on around you, which is the red parts of the brain. So those have to do with input that is processed through other areas of the brain first before it reaches the insula. And then the blue arrows are the prediction error. So when I was saying, like, you expect something to happen, it did not happen the way you thought it was going to happen. So the insula is sending information about, like, what went wrong and receiving information back with all of these other areas of the brain. And so it communicates to the rest of the brain if something happens with your body. So for example, with our mouse, if it didn't have food when it woke up in the morning, then it's really hungry. And so that feeling of hunger in its body is what's going to drive the sensation of it being in a bad mood. And this was almost where I put in a joke about being hangry, but I couldn't find one that I liked enough. But you can imagine that, like, if you feel hungry and you can't find food, then your mood is even worse. And we know what that is because we call it hangry, right? So the way the insula actually processes things, and I'm going to use a different metaphor here because this came from a real paper. So someone did a study looking at insula activity where they would put people in the MRI machine and they would ask them to imagine buying clothes. And it was basically like, would you buy this, dress? And so this describes sort of how you would go through the process of getting a good sense of whether you're going to buy the dress. So you have the sensation of your body, so you put the dress on and you're like, does the dress feel comfortable on me? Does it fit me? And then you may sort of like look around and feel like, if I sit down, is it going to be okay? And then you start thinking like, well, is it too cold in here? Like, do I feel right? And then you start putting all these other kinds of information that come in from different brain regions. Then you start thinking like, does it make me happy? Like, do I feel beautiful in it? And then you start thinking like, is this too punk rock, or is it soccer mom, or like, what am I saying here? Like, what am I projecting with the dress? And then you start thinking like, okay, I was going to spend $100, but this dress is $150. And if I put it on my credit card, how am I going to figure out how? So there's like, do I have the resources to buy the dress, right? Like, and what is my plan to get there? So if all of those things don't add up, then you're going to have a bad feeling about buying the dress, and you're not going to buy the dress. But if they do add up, then you are going to buy the dress. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is really more related to what I study, so I'm sorry it's not as funny. what my research actually is on sort of neuroimmunity and how the brain and the immune system interact. And the way that works is because in all of the system of the nervous system going down and collecting information from organs and giving information to organs, it also connects to the immune system. So our lymph nodes are innervated by the autonomic nervous system primarily. And that serves both for the brain to detect what's going on in the immune system as well as for it to influence the immune system. And so the way that we experience this most often in daily life is through something called sickness behavior, which everybody here has experienced. So you get a bad cold, you get bronchitis, and you don't feel well. But we don't even think about it because it happens so commonly, but this is actually a behavior that's extremely consistent throughout not just human beings, but animals. And it has the same symptoms no matter what type of illness that you have. So people who are sick are tired, they don't sleep well, they're not as cognitively aware as they normally are, and if it becomes severe enough, they'll become delirious where they're completely cognitively out of touch. You don't feel like doing anything, and you don't really feel like eating. And this happens as far as we can tell because it, like other aspects of mood, it redirects your resources for you to stay home and rest so that you will heal. Right, so it's bringing back the behavior into allowing you to meet your plan as best as it can. So the way that sickness behavior actually works from a immune perspective is that when your immune cells detect that you're ill, so either from an infection or from just an injury, all of these are TLR stands for toll-like receptor. It's a type of receptor that's expressed on immune cells. And they respond to this in part by making these cytokines. And so cytokines are sort of like an alarm signal that your immune system uses. And if it makes enough of them, and so they're not just local, like you have a little cut on your finger, that doesn't make you feel sick, right? You've got some cytokines down there, but they're not spreading throughout your whole body. If they spread enough, they are detected by the vagus nerve, which has those nerve endings in the lymph nodes, and that goes up into the brain, and it causes this sickness syndrome. And so inside the brain, we know that sickness is mediated, at least in part, by the insula. So I'm leaving some stuff out here in terms of all the areas of the brain that are affected, but because I'm focusing on the insula. So this is a study where they did this devious task with human beings in the MRI scanner. So what you have to do here is you have to read the word, even though the word is in a different color, right? And it's very annoying. And you guys can try it and then pretend you did it really well. This is what we all do. It's like, it's fine, but it's actually quite hard. So you have to say like red, green, blue, and your brain has to work extra hard to do this. And when they did this study, they injected the patients with like inactive bacteria. And so even though they weren't actually infected with anything live, they felt really, really bad after that happened. And so then they asked them to do this task and they scanned them. And so you can see that the insula has to work extra hard for them to perform the task successfully after they've been injected. And if you look at the pathway going down, this is a pathway that receives sensory information up through the periaqueductal gray down here, and then the amygdala and the insula are responsible for sort of how you would judge how important something is. And so the interpretation of this is that probably the insula is working really hard to turn off your feelings of how bad you're feeling so that instead of doing that task, you can focus on doing this successfully. So the cool thing about sickness behavior, too, is that it works the other way around. So if you need to, you can actually turn your immune activity down by putting neurotransmitters onto the lymph nodes through the vagus. So it's sending a signal down to the nervous ganglion, and then this goes out to the lymph node. And so if you have something that you really, really need to do, your brain will tell your body, like, don't get sick yet. And so oftentimes when I explain this, I talk about when I was like in 8th grade. And I was a nerd, so I really cared a lot about my exams. and I took my last exam, and then within like half an hour of the exam, I had like 103 fever, and I was kind of like loopy, and I did something apparently really embarrassing, which I still don't know exactly what it was, but they had to call my mom to come pick me up from school because I was so ill. And speaking of which, my mom is actually here today in the audience, so she can tell you on the way out if you want to know what embarrassing thing I did. Okay, but because I was such a nerd, I suppressed being sick all through my final exams. And then it was like, as soon as that went away and I knew I was done and I was ready to be sick, within a few minutes, then that response was allowed to come back up. So the brain can actually have pretty serious influence on how our body is feeling. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and kind of talk more about some examples of how this happens. That are maybe a little bit more interesting, and which I hope that you guys enjoy. So we're going to talk about the placebo effect and how that works. So when we think about the placebo effect, this is a great quote from one of the papers that I've read. It says it's the ritual of the therapeutic effect. So not the thing itself, but the ritual surrounding it. And there are two main sort of things that cause people to experience placebo effects. One of them is someone telling you, or other cues telling you that you're going to feel better. And the other one is just conditioning. So you don't have to be consciously aware of the cues that you're going to feel better. You just have to have been exposed to them, right? So it could be conscious, someone telling you, or it can be unconscious that you've learned from some type of experience. And we're going to talk about some examples of that. And so these two things cause actual placebo effect through both psychological processes, but also biological mechanisms. So there's also the nocebo effect, which is common in my practice. All right, to tell my patients, this is the deal. You are not to go home and Google your medication. And because, if you're already inclined to be anxious, as my patients are as a psychiatrist, it can be really bad for you. You will get every single thing that you see on the internet. And we know that it probably does contribute to a lot of syndromes that people who have anxiety and depression tend to have at higher rates than other people. So I wanted to talk about sort of the components of the placebo response, and so because the placebo effect is only a part of it. And so this is from a study by an investigator who studies placebos basically as his main interest. And he did the study where all the people in the study got a placebo. So there was no active treatment. And what he was trying to do is compare different types of placebos. So some of the people got a waiting list. They just were told, like, in 2 months, we'll start treating you. Some of the people got a placebo that was, in this case, was a procedure. And then some of the people received that procedure from a person who was trained to really talk up how great it was going to work, right? So these people, like the person who did it didn't say anything or just minimally communicated with them. And then these people got a lot of like enthusiastic endorsement of the procedure. And also, by the way, that it was a placebo. Like, this was all placebos, okay? So you can tell people that it's a placebo and it still works. It doesn't have to be secret. But so you can see that basically there was some effect of just doing the procedure, but if you talk to the people, talked up the procedure, then they had a much bigger response. And that was true whether you measured their symptom severity or their quality of life. And so this was actually for irritable bowel syndrome was the illness that they all had. But the important thing is that even the people on the wait list had some improvement. And there are sort of reasons why that is, that have to do with, when you enroll people in a study, you enroll people when their symptoms are severe. And that's both because we do that on purpose and because when you are feeling really badly is when you may go look for treatment or go to your doctor or ask about being in a study. So it's pretty common that people who are in studies, some of them will just get better on their own for reasons that have nothing to do with being in the research, right? So the placebo effect is specifically these parts of things, even though the placebo response includes some stuff that has nothing to do with the treatment itself. So a great example of how this works, and this is also kind of devious, and I question who signed up for this study, but so this was done in Italy, where they had an Alp nearby, and they recruited a whole bunch of students, and they were going to go up to 3,500 meters from like sea level. And they divided them into a nocebo group and a control group, and then they looked to see who got a headache up in altitude. And then they further divided the people who did get a headache, and some of them received a placebo, some received aspirin, and some received no treatment. So I guess they must have been like the undergraduates of the person or something, and they felt like so. And the most devious thing about this whole study is that the way that they did it, so he had like 121 people. They went to one person and they told him, man, you know how bad it is going up the mountain? You're gonna get a really bad headache and it's terrible. And like, you have to really watch it. And we never go up to this research station without bringing aspirin with us because aspirin is the only thing that helps, but just like, for sure, you're gonna get a headache. And then they like let that poor person just like talk to their friends. And so they somehow, like, I think it was like they actually took text off their phone and stuff like that. Like, they tracked what they were doing. So they figured out how many times each of them had been told by somebody else, oh, you're going to get a headache when you go up the mountain, right? And then, but all of these people were maybe not in the same friend network. And so they didn't hear the message, the nocebo message. And so when they looked at them, like after they were up there for like 24 hours, you can see that the number of times someone told them, oh, you're going to get a headache, correlated with how much pain they had. So this is the white dots are pain. And then this one, even more amazingly, so we're going to talk about this more, this is the increase in prostaglandin E3, which is an inflammatory marker. And so the people not only had more pain, but they also were more inflamed, just from being told by their friends that they were definitely going to get a headache. And so here we can see more of the immune markers. So basically this figure, you don't have to worry about the details, but this is the control group and the nocebo group. And this is the relative amounts increase relative to control of all of the inflammatory markers that they measured, as well as their pain level. And you can see down here, they also measured cortisol, and that was also increased in the nocebo group, suggesting that they were stressed somewhat by this message that they would get a headache, and that may potentially be related to what happened to them. And it was also true that when they gave them, so you can see this is their pain before. But when they gave them the aspirin worked very well in both groups. But the placebo worked pretty well in the group who had been told that they were going to get headaches, and it didn't really work at all in the people who had no idea about the headache. So I really like this study. But it was kind of cruel to those people, and I hope that they gave these poor people who, like, no treatment people, that they got something in the end or whatever after this was all over, because it was mean to make them get a headache. But the thing that is most interesting to me is that they didn't only experience the pain, they also experienced the biomarkers and the physiological change of the pain, and that when you treated them with aspirin, even that reduced this marker that was only increased just because they had talked themselves into it in the first place. So a different use of the placebo effect is nice. I promise. I picked a nice one. So this was in people who had gotten a kidney transplant. And so one of the problems with kidney transplant patients is that the medication that we use to prevent rejection is extremely toxic. And so people have been really interested in finding ways to reduce the amount of medication that these patients need. So in this study, what they did was, they would give them their medication with a drink that had a distinct flavor. And they did this for some period of time, a few days, and got them to associate taking their medication with a drink. Then they continued to do that, but they inserted placebo pills in between the times that the patients actually took their medication, and they gave them the drink with a placebo as well. And so the drink became what they call conditioned stimulus, meaning that the person was associating that with the physiological effect of taking the immunosuppressant medication, right? The drink is connected in their minds. And so even if the people know what they're taking as a placebo with the drink, they still have that association that they've learned. And so they also looked at their immune function by collecting blood samples before and after they did this. And so you could see that at the times that they took the placebo pill, so like the white bars are what happens with nothing. So they take the medicine somewhere at 0 hours. And then over time, as the medicine gets out of their body, their immune response goes back up. So they lose that immune suppression. But when you give them the placebo drink, they maintain their immune suppression between doses of medication. And so this study is just one, but there are several studies like this where they've used this, where you can maintain a medication effect by pairing that medication with a particular stimulus. Usually they use a taste stimulus, and that it will functionally extend the effect of the medication. So people are really interested in looking at this as a way that we could not treat these patients with immunosuppressants, because they had to learn to associate the actual effect of the immunosuppressant with the liquid for it to work. But you could reduce the amount of drug that they need to take to keep their immune system suppressed. All right, so this example is another one of my favorites. This is from a lab of someone who I actually know. And they do fabulous work in this area. And so they studied how people feel when they are excluded socially, so like their emotional pain. And they would do this by having people play a little video game where they would be told that these little avatars were two other people. And they were supposed to throw the ball back and forth. And so they would all throw the ball for a minute or two, and then these two people would start excluding the person who was the study participant, and they just throw the ball back and forth to them. And this task was known to activate the anterior cingulate cortex, which is an important role in sort of social comparisons. And so I thought this was really funny because this task was, the paper was published in 2000, and that if the people had created it today, that it would be called the FOMO task. You get left out. But so after they had run this a few times and they could show that people felt left out by playing the little video game, they pre-treated them with Tylenol before they had them do the task. And they found that by treating people with Tylenol, that they didn't feel as their feelings were less hurt when they were excluded. And they also then scanned them, and they could see activity, again, in the anterior cingulate, but also in the insula. And that was, it was decreased dramatically in the people who actually received the acetaminophen and not people who received placebo. So this isn't really a placebo effect, but it does show something really interesting, that they had no reason whatsoever, as far as we would know, to experience physical pain that acetaminophen would treat, right? But they still responded to the pain reduction to just the emotional sensation with the physical treatment. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm most interested in, which is, why are people with depression so sick? And so when I started, my practice really specializes in patients who are depressed. That's most of what I treat. And it turns out that those patients are often very medically ill. And I have a lot of people who we have complicated treatment because they're on a lot of medications, they see a lot of doctors, and they are really stubbornly sick. And in fact, if you look at what we call excess mortality associated with depression, it's large. So people who are depressed have deaths that are for causes other than suicide in an excess of about 90,000 people a year who would not have died if they were not depressed. And that ends up being somewhere around 8 to 10 years of life lost. And it is much higher than the number of people who are depressed who die by suicide. So this is like medical illness is the leading reason why people who are depressed die, right? And if you look specifically at some narrow scenario of people who are discharged from the hospital, if you compare the ones who are not depressed, that's the green line, with the ones who are depressed, after 24 months, there's about a 50% increase in the mortality rate in people who are depressed after they get out of the hospital. So when you think about the fact that depression is extremely common, that close to 20% of people will experience an episode of depression in their lives, and about 10% of people will experience more than one, this could be a massive number of people, right? This is not a small percentage of the population. It's a lot of people. And so what do they die from? They die from cardiac disease, stroke. It's a number of neurodegenerative diseases and dementias. They die from diabetes, cancer. So most people don't realize it, but if you've been depressed your whole life, you're at higher risk of developing cancer than other people are. And so you can see this is the rate of depression in the general population, 10%, and then almost all of these diseases are considerably higher. Not on here is autoimmune diseases, but if you look at things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, the depression rate is almost 50%. It's really, really high. So I wanted to know, why are my patients so sick? And one of the things that I noticed that all these diseases had in common was that they had problems with the immune system. And so that was kind of how I got interested in looking at immunity. But then, as I started to do this work, I learned more about interoception, and I learned that, big surprise, people with depression have alterations in their interoception. So this paper asked people to pay attention to their heart beating. And that was all they asked them to do. But people who were depressed showed less activity in their insula and related regions while they were trying to focus on their heart. So they were not able to do the task as successfully. And in related studies where they asked them to guess what their heart rate was, people with depression are much less good at doing that than other people. So it's not just that they show lower brain activity, but they also show less ability to do that than other people. And there are some other things that where they've looked at, like gut sensation or bladder sensation or other parts of the body, where you see the same sorts of data. So it seems like people with depression are less well able to accurately determine what's going on in their bodies, and that is related to this insula pathway. And if you look at the connectivity between the insula and other regions of the brain, it's also altered in depression. So in my work, one of the things that I looked at was people getting vaccines. And so this was a project that I did when I was at UT Southwestern before I came here a couple years ago, where I sent my RA. She sat outside the little office where they were giving the employee flu shots at a little table. She asked people if they would be willing to fill out some surveys for her before they got their flu shot. And we had a whole bunch of great volunteers who filled out some surveys for us about how they were feeling that day. And then they went in and they got their flu shot. And then we emailed them the next day and we asked them how they were feeling. And so we asked them to self-report whether they had been diagnosed with depression or anxiety. And then we compared their mood before they got the flu vaccine and after. So people who were healthy mentally, they didn't have depression and anxiety, they didn't really have a change in mood. This is just a drop in their positive mood. But the people who were depressed, they had a big drop in positive mood from before and after the vaccination. And we had already seen some data that just from asking people, how are you feeling today, before they got their flu shot, the better they felt, the more antibodies they made to the vaccine. So we had some sense when we did this project that there was physiological relevance to this phenomenon. But the interesting thing about this too was that we figured out that the negative mood symptoms didn't change nearly as much. It was not so much that they felt bad as they just felt less good. But that was really confined to the mentally ill, and that may make you think about the sickness response, where one of the symptoms is anhedonia, which is not feeling happy. And there's also studies that look at just, do you feel like you get side effects from vaccines? And people with depression and anxiety were more likely. So it's sort of like this phenomenon of feeling like, oh, that flu shot makes me feel like I have the flu. That some of that may be exaggerated or exacerbated by psychiatric symptoms. So right now we're doing a study where we're trying to figure out what's going on with this so we can understand which part of this system, if we can, is responsible. So is it something going on in the brain? Is it something going on in the immune system? Is it something going on in how they talk to each other? So what we're doing now is we're going to give people flu shots, and we're going to draw their blood before we do that, the next day, and then they have them come back at day 3. And we're going to look at their mood response, not just at those 2 time points, but over time. So we're guessing that their mood may look something like this, and I don't know yet, because this is still going on. But then we're going to also look at their inflammatory markers. So one possibility is that the depressed people will make more inflammatory markers than the healthy people. So if you think about like some of these placebo response studies where if people go into it with a point of view of like, every time I get this flu shot and they're not in a good mood, it's gonna make me feel worse, then they may actually make more inflammation to the flu shot than other people. But we don't know whether or not that's true. So that's one of the options. But the other option is that they won't, that they're going to make the same amount of inflammatory response as the healthy people, but that their mood response is exaggerated. And that would imply that basically the brain is hypersensitive to what's going on, and it feels all of the cytokines in the periphery, and it creates an exaggerated behavioral response, even though the immune response is the same. And there are several different sort of subversions of that, obviously. But this would be one of the first ways that we really understand, or we'll start to understand what goes wrong in immunity in people with depression. So one of the other things that I'm lucky to be able to add to this project is we're also going to start scanning people. And so we're going to have them do a slightly different task than the ones I discussed before. This is called the Ultimatum Game. It's also sort of a FOMO task where the person invests money with another person, and then the other person can screw them over or not. And so it's like, here's my money. And they're like, I'm taking all the money. Or they can like invest it in a way that gives them both money back. So when people feel rejected in this task, they really do not like it. Even though there's not really real money involved, we do pay them at the end based on how they perform, but it's not nearly as much as they're supposedly virtually investing. And then we ask them how they feel while they're doing it. And then we're going to look at the activity in the insula and how the insula is connected to other brain regions. And so this is a figure from the same task in a different population that one of my collaborators did. And so you can see in these people that when they thought the other person was going to be nice, that's what norm prediction error is, but instead the person was a jerk. Then when there was very little error, when the person behaved the way they thought, the insula wasn't very active, but it was very active when the prediction error was high. And so we're going to look to see how all of this functions in depression. All right, so in conclusion, so what I hope you guys picked up today is that the state of the body is foundational for the perception of emotion. The brain can respond via the immune system to affect people's health. And disruptions in this system are likely in depression, and they may explain why depression is associated with poor physical health. And so I thank you guys again for coming. It was awesome, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have with my colleague, Mimba.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to assemble our panel, and Dr. Marisa Toups will be part of it. And I'll also want to introduce you to another member of the Department of Psychiatry here at the Dell Medical School. This is Dr. Mimba Jabi, also a part of psychiatry and an expert on many things. And so there she is, award-winning Elena Silva. This is the number that you can text, and let me give you some advice. It doesn't take very many words to fill up the screen, so it's best if you keep your questions short. Like I told you, when you text your questions, they'll go here. Our panelists will select them, and they send them to Elena, who will put them on the screen. I read them. I don't, because I have to do something, and then our panelists will answer. As we approach the time that we're supposed to stop, I'll invoke speed mode, which will have a rapid fire, as many questions as we can, and then we'll get it going. So, how are we doing with the questions? And then, of course, I promise to use the microphone for anybody. So if you're raising your hand for a question, wave it around so that I can see it. Okay. So first question is, can interoception be practiced or learned?
That's a good question. As in many skills and survival tricks, interoception can be learned. In fact, there are studies that shows that when people are randomly assigned to mindfulness, how do you call it again? Meditation, thank you. The group that is trained according to a specific Buddhist tradition to very well control their feelings as well as their emotions, over time, not only are they able to sense the inner feelings of their body, for example, gut sensations, but when you put them in the scanner, this is done by Max Planck's group in Germany, if you put them in the scanner, you also see that that skill learning in terms of getting better sense of their body is correlated or associated with change in insula structure and function over time. So yes, it can be learned, but not very consciously as saying, I'm going to do it today, and it would happen.
Okay. Please don't make me read all of that.
Did you choose it?
I picked a couple of you. I did pick a few. We have to look. Do they? Yeah, they show up on ours.
Live by the computer, die by the computer. Okay, here we go. Show me the question.
Yes.
Oh. Panelists, does treating depression improve physical health problems?
So the answer to that is sometimes. And this is a complicated topic. So part of my work in Dallas, we did a lot of studies looking at things like that. So if we took people with diabetes and depression and we treated their depression, did that improve their diabetes outcomes? And the answer was really, does it depend on it depends on what you measure as the outcome. So people were happier, obviously, when you treated their depression, but they complied better with their medical care. They would take their medications better. They would show up for visits more. But in some of the more, like measuring their hemoglobin A1C and things like that, those outcomes can be a little bit stubborn to improve. I can definitely tell you from my practice that the other way around, if I have patients who don't take care of their diabetes, I can't get rid of their depression. They won't respond to medications at all. So part of the reason why it's so hard to do is because it's like a chicken or an egg problem. You have to treat both for people to get better.
I have a question.
Okay, here we go. Thank you for saving us.
I was just wondering if there are any plans to, through your study of the connection between vaccinations and depression and the kind of feedback loop, I guess, that happens between what we make that mean, could that explain why, like, some people believe in these things about, like, vaccinations are causing autism and they refuse to vaccinate their children? And, like, could those people maybe dealing with depression and they're more likely to believe conspiracy theories and stories that have no basis in reality?
Oh, gosh. So before this, I was like, I'm going to get a question about vaccination conspiracy theories. So is your question really, do I think? So, honestly, I think when you talk about the perspective of what you learn in the quote-unquote therapeutic environment, and so vaccinations are really unique in that way. So we go in there when we're healthy to get them. And then someone sticks you with a needle, and then you feel kind of, your arm sore for a few days. And so it doesn't have that therapeutic aura around it that other types of healthcare do. Like, you're not going to your doctor because you're feeling sick. And if you especially think about kids, and I don't know, if anyone who's had to take their child to get a flu shot or other vaccines, your kid's all like happy, and then you have to hold them down, and they're crying, and they stick them and they scream and scream, and it's terrible. And you think like deeply emotionally, you think these vaccines are terrible. They made my kid cry, right? I mean, so like is there a leap between that and thinking the vaccines must have something wrong with them? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, maybe it does.
Just to be fair, it's not just kids that cry when they get vaccines. So, you want to try?
Hi, my name is April, and I do ABA, and that's Applied Behavioral Analysis. I also have that question with a lot of parents that coming in, is with the vaccine shots, is related with the correlation of the brain, how it is a factor with autism. And is there going to ever be a study with that? Because as doing behavioral science, I have a lot of parents asking me that about the correlation of the brain, how it is with anxiety, depression, and those mental health.
So are you asking me, do I believe that vaccines could cause depression or anxiety?
What I'm asking is, like, is there a correlation between it with the autism? Like, I have parents actually asking me, like, what is everything added up? Because it's a dual diagnosis. They have autism, but they also have anxiety, depression, and all that.
So I think the most definitive answer to that type of question is, if you think that what the vaccine is like a little tiny piece of the virus, right? And you put it in your body and you get a little tiny piece of the immune response that helps your body respond to that if it ever sees it. So if you think the vaccine could hurt you in some way permanently, just think about what the actual infection would be able to do, right? I mean, like, the infection is not only more things than is in the vaccine, but it's also stronger and longer lasting. And so even though I'm looking at what in my research as sort of a negative effect of vaccination technically, but it's just to be clear, it doesn't last more than a day, right? So you feel bad for a day, but this is not something that we think is permanent. And sometimes when I've given talks, I've actually talked about, like, what do I think it would take to cause permanent brain damage? And the answer is a lot more than a vaccine.
Okay, so back to the computer. Panelists, will you expand on why depression is very common in people with autoimmune diseases?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can. Yeah. So there are a couple of ways to answer this question, and just to take the approach as a neuroscientist who deals with models, keeping in mind that given the complexity of the brain, we do not understand a lot about how things are connected. So to answer this question, will you expand on why depression is very common in people with autoimmune disease? One way to answer this is that obviously autoimmune diseases, by definition, are a serious challenge to the balance of the body, so what we call homeostasis. So that's the state at which the body is in a balanced state. So if there is a huge autoimmune challenge that's coming from, say, multiple sclerosis, the body is not in balance. So there is a feeling of sickness based on the distortion of the general immunity. On the other hand, if we take that picture of autoimmunity and just think of how much bombarded somebody is in a very bad relationship or a very important thing in their life just went away, and say both parents died and they are grieving, or any other psychological challenge, that in and of itself also kind of challenges the body in a way that it goes out of balance. So you have two forces whereby one is coming from the autoimmune axis, the other one is how environment challenge us to become sick, which we call depressed, and then they are related according to how they connect to the brain. So from this perspective, from the modeling perspective, you can connect them that way. On the other hand, when autoimmune systems challenge the body in such a way that it takes us down, and perhaps our ability to also deal with emotional challenges become impaired. So because you are already forced in your immunity to be in a bad state and your body is not in balance, if other things come on top of that from a psychological, social perspective, the road down towards depression becomes very easy.
I think that was a long way of saying if I knew the answer, I would have put it in my talk.
So how is it that these concepts can be applied to treatments?
So I really hope that I'm going to figure that out also. There is already a lot of work looking at therapy that modulates the immune system as a way of treating depression. And it does work. The reason why we're not doing it right now on a large scale is because all of our immune modulatory medications are very dangerous, right? They have a lot of side effects. So trying to figure out how to do it in a way that's safe has been a challenge. But there is a ton of evidence for other things that reduce immune activity, like harmful immune activity, like inflammation, as effective for depression. And those things include exercise as the biggest one. Exercise is very anti-inflammatory. It helps your immune system stay in the balance that it's supposed to be in, probably through these interoceptive mechanisms that the more, as you have experiences of moving your body, that helps keep everything lined up. But also things like the microbiome and diet and stuff like that also affect inflammation.
Oh boy, here we go. Keep your question short. Does treating depression improve physical health problems?
Well, we did that one already.
Yeah, I think so.
I knew that. Let's go with this one. Is this why we exercise, sleep, and eat healthy food? Okay. Is this connection why we exercise, sleep, and health food is important when you're depressed?
So, yeah.
You want to go for that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's just like I said, all of those things were really important, and that's probably part of the reason why. So I didn't mention sleep, but sleep is also good for your HPA axis function and therefore for your immune function as well.
I'm anxious about reading this question. Does anxiety have similar impacts on physical health as depression? Are there differences between the two mental illnesses and how they impact the body?
Yeah, so if you could recall Dr. Toups' graph that she was showing the connection between arousal and emotion and how the different emotions can code within that box, that very nicely answers this question. If you look at any population of people with anxiety, even if you call it primary anxiety, the comorbidity with depression is really high. And if you look at any population where we call they are primarily depressed, which primary here actually means there is more depression than other diseases. The comorbidity with anxiety is usually the highest. So mood, the way it's coded, can actually be called anxiety. For example, if your mood is not only going down, but it's unstable in such a way it can be volatile, that is an expression that's very close to anxiety. So yes, to answer this question, they can impact physical health in similar ways.
How does someone with treatment-resistant depression compare to someone with regular depression health-wise?
So if you talk to a psychiatrist, treatment-resistant depression means a specific thing. And so sometimes we have some variation in that, but more or less it means that someone has come in to see a physician or another type of provider and received at least 2 different types of treatments, either medication, psychotherapy, both, and they have not gotten better. So they now are on their 3rd or 4th or 5th treatment for that particular episode. And so these people generally do not do well. In addition to having more untreatable symptoms of depression or more difficult to treat symptoms of depression, this is sort of what my practice specializes in, and we get a lot of people doing a lot better. But they have more significant health impacts than other people do. So they're really, in many ways, the target population of who we would consider doing things like treating them with immunosuppressant medication, right? Because they just don't get well.
What comes first, the depression or a malfunctioning insula?
Yeah, that's, if we know the answer to that question.
You can come up here at the end of the talk.
Yes, yes. And I guess it's also fair to say if we do know the answer to that question, we'll start something that's more than just a pharmaceutical company, but it will solve a lot of problems. Yeah. You can go back to it again. Yeah. It's bidirectional. And in fact, to be honest, all complex diseases, not only psychiatric, but since we start by the fusion of two cells from mom and dad, and those cells are programmed to really build this complex system that fills this room here, and then we are doing this complex dialogue, it's really, there is nothing you can explain in a simple way. So to get to this, there is a developmental aspect of it. Some depressions start really very early, maybe before the brain is even formed or during the formation of the brain. So in that case, it will be the malformation of the brain from which the insula is a part that's going to lead to depression. But obviously, we function in an environment, and as Dr. Toups showed, sometimes our expectations doesn't go very well. For the poor mice that is trying to get the cheese and go out there and procreate and create a colony of new mice, just getting harassed by a cat that could even lead to the demise of the mice, if the mice end up escaping, have serious consequences physically. So that is the insula and the network it's connected with, helping the mouse to escape from the cat, given the disappointing turn of events. But then, at the end of the day, if that keeps happening to the mouse, it's going to get depressed. So the connection is bidirectional, or maybe even more complex than that.
In relation to conditioned immune suppression, what do you think could this potentially be applied to? Could this extend the lifetime of Parkinson's patients? Medications or antidepressants?
So there actually are, not exactly like that, but there are a number of studies looking at using placebo mechanisms, like conditioned mechanisms in Parkinson's disease. And it's actually one of the disorders for which this type of thing actually works pretty well. So it could improve function in Parkinson's patients while they need to take less medication. So yeah, it's actually a great example.
Yeah.
Interoception. We went.
You guys need to click more questions there.
Yeah, I think we clicked on a couple more.
Yeah.
I'm trying to pick some, but I don't even know if what we're picking has anything to do with it.
Okay.
Have you talked
Here we
about
go.
that?
Here we go.
I sent it, but it hasn't shown up yet.
Yeah.
I just wonder, in your research or in your opinion, if SSRIs, which is the most common antidepressant, help quality and I can't say the word, interoception, and or have you seen placebo effects with antidepressants?
So if you've seen any studies,
Well, I guess it is the receptor part. Yeah, so this is a very good question, and I guess it's hard to answer, to be honest. But taking it from a mechanistic perspective, it has to do with some of the real estate that SSRIs are actually acting on. So just by definition of their name, serotonin uptake inhibitors. So they kind of do something there in the brain. And if that's spread and it includes a whole network, and so the functioning of that network, not only in terms of structure, but the tuning back and forth to make sense of the environment becomes facilitated. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But I was just curious about placebo. Do people ever give people placebo antidepressants?
Yes.
I mean, in research we do, yes. And depression is known, I almost talked about that, but I felt like I didn't have time, that depression is known for having a pretty high placebo response rate. And if you think about not medications, but how we treat medication with therapy, we basically tell people, like, stop thinking those bad thoughts, think some more positive thoughts. And when they do that for a while, then they get less depressed. And so the evil version of that is sort of like a placebo, right? I mean, like, you don't even need to put the placebo, you just tell them what you need to do is work on the belief that you're gonna get better, and then it's not instant. It's not like you can make it just go away, but we do know that changing your frame of mind is helpful for people with depression, and they can work towards treating it.
Okay, is dance/movement therapy effective at treating mental health?
All exercise is effective for mental health, so including that. I definitely think, I tell patients a lot, like, your job is to have a positive experience of being in your body. So it doesn't matter what you do. If you like dancing, that's great. If you like walking, that's great. If you can only walk for 5 minutes before you're in pain, just walk for 5 minutes. Like, do whatever you can do to have a positive experience.
How is it determined that someone would not have died if they were not depressed?
So this is a question that is answered by the magic of statistics. We cannot tell you whether you as an individual would have not died, but we can look at the population level and estimate how many people would have not died.
Seems like a good question. Is there a way to use therapy to retrain the immune system affected by depression?
I don't know if I can answer this one. Anyway, I can
I'm
give
not
it
sure
a
exactly
shot,
what if they mean medication or psychotherapy or.
Yeah. So I mean, so I guess the question is, what do you mean by retraining the immune system? Of course, if I take a guess, you mean by immune memory, because the immune system means that the cells that are focused on a specific pathogen develops memory for those pathogens, and when they master that and kill them all, they are always ready whenever that invasive type of pathogen comes into the body, they are there to attack. And that's what vaccines basically do. So is there a way to use therapy to train the immune system affected by depression? I don't know how a specific immune system, since they are really very specific and numerous, it's not very specified which immune pathways are selectively affected by depression, but there could be a way to do this. It's just not mechanistically clear. Maybe you can add to this.
Yeah, I mean, I would also, if you know how to do this, come up here and we can have a conversation. So yeah, we don't know yet. I hope that we can figure out some ways to do that.
Here we go. What role does age play in all of this?
So I love
Asking for a friend.
Yeah. No. So like I already told you, like my mom is in the audience today, so she's probably seeing the same thing. So one of the things that happens to us as we age is that our immune systems get less good at. They also age, right? They get less good at responding flexibly to different type of stimuli that we have, and we know that people who have childhood trauma and other life experiences that place them at greater risk of developing depression as adults show signs of accelerated aging. And in particular, they show signs of what we do not know definitively, but is circumstantial evidence for accelerated aging of the immune system, so that their immune systems function as if they're older than they are. This is something that I'm really interested in. I've been putting grants in to look at, and it may be something that turns out to be really important. On the other hand, overall in the population, the time when people are most depressed is midlife. As people get older and they get towards the end of their life, the rates of depression actually go down. So we don't know for sure exactly what the relationship is.
Has the social exclusion experiment been conducted with painkillers that have known MOAs?
Yeah, so mechanisms of action is what I think the person asking that question means. Well, I guess the mechanism of action for aspirin is...
So for acetaminophen, we are pretty sure acetaminophen is a COX enzyme inhibitor like aspirin, although through a different mechanism. Yeah. There are a lot of experiments in animals that opiates are really, really good at treating social pain. We don't like to do them in humans because we don't like to give humans opiates if we don't need to. But there are a ton of experiments in animals that if you separate baby mice from their mothers, you really damage them psychologically for the rest of their lives. But if you separate them from their mothers and you give them opiates, then it blocks that. So there are definitely some indications that other mechanisms of actions might also.
Are people with previously existing immune issues more likely to develop depression?
Definitely, they are. People with immune system disorders are at the highest rates, highest risk of pretty much almost any type of medical illness. So we definitely think this is bidirectional. There are some people who come to it by developing an immune system disorder, and then there are some people who are probably depressed first and then develop the health problems as a result of depression.
What data does the brain interpret more quickly, a negative thought or a negative emotion? Do we match them? Role of depression.
Yeah, that's an interesting
It's a haiku.
question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And as you will recall in Dr. Toups' presentation, it really all depends on context. However, to be specific and perhaps take a shot at this question, we have to see the survival valuation of what's negative and what's positive. Yeah. So if something really, really great is going to happen to us, perhaps it's a feeling that we'll remember for a long time, and the greatest could be, reproducing another copy of yourself or things along that nature. However, there are a lot of ways that something bad could happen to us that would end our lives, or maybe even many more others. So by that level, how the brain really code this and get us into action, the urgencies are different. So if you look at it that way, if somebody really bad just happen to be around us and we need to get away, the way the brain deals with that, the urgency and the lack of room for error is much higher than when you are going out there and looking for a fun opportunity.
Does interoception explain why some blood pressure medications can reduce social anxiety?
Yes, it does. So in fact, and it also explains why medications can cause anxiety. So if we take anybody and you manipulate their CO2 in their blood, we can make you have a panic attack. And it has nothing to do with whether you have anything happening to you that would make you anxious. Similarly, many of the medications that we use that are non-sedatives for anxiety work because they slow down your heart rate. And when your heart rate is slower, your insula is like, I must not be anxious. My heart's not beating fast, and you don't feel anxious.
If depression is cured, quote unquote, is it technically cured or is it still there? Is it possible for it to come back?
I mean, I don't consider us capable of curing it. Truthfully, 50% of people who have one episode will never have another one, about half of people. We don't have any understanding of what's different about those people than the people who go on to have a chronic course. I don't think there's anything that I do as a physician that I would consider to be curing the disease.
Since a mismatch in expectation error can cause an increase in immune markers, is UT dangerous to, is it? Is it dangerous to tell someone that a painful procedure isn't going to hurt?
Yeah, is it dangerous?
Is it dangerous?
Well, there is some ethics involved.
Yeah, I mean, I am against telling people that things are not going to hurt if they will hurt. I think it's kind of a jerk move. I don't know that it's dangerous, though. That's a deep question. I'm not sure I'm up for that one.
Can the brain project emotional pain onto the body?
Yeah, so that's possible. However, I think we need to give it a try, and very timely based on Dr. Toups' presentation, that brain-body is not a binary thing, it's just the same. Right. So the brain is part of the body. It's up there that kind of drives and controls the body. So can the brain project emotional pain onto the body? The brain is the central organ that senses that something noxious is going on somewhere. And if you remember that huge wiring from the brain on one of Dr. Toups' slides that goes all the way down, it's connected. It's just really one big nervous system. So yes, it can do that, but not in isolation because it's really the same connected thing.
And if you're interested in this topic, there's a wonderful book about trauma and physical illness and the effects of trauma that's called The Body Keeps the Score, that talks a lot about that particular topic.
What about interception in manic states?
Yeah, that's a good question. So interoception is distorted when homeostasis is distorted. So if you see it as a wiring issue, so if the brain is trying to sense what's going on in the body, how balanced is it, and if that body state is knocked out, part of that back and forth information is not going to go well. And in mania, there is a huge presence of delusions and just subjectively not being aware of the reality as it is, and sometimes hyperbolically seeing possibilities that are not there. And there is also this issue that mania tend to co-occur quite a bit with psychosis. So if you put all of those together, yes, it will distort it, but not as a direct hit. It's just a connection of different things coming together.
Okay, last question. Since the placebo effect has shown remarkable results over the course of history, do you believe this procedure should expand in the medical field?
Thank you for putting me on the spot, whoever this person is. So,
Yeah, thanks, Mom.
yeah, wait, is that my mom? No. So, so it depends on what you mean, right? Like, I don't lie to my patients. I do tell them things like, if you Google your medication that you will get the side effects that are on the list. So it's better for us to agree that you're not going to do that. And I do also tell them, I have experience with these medications and people do get better and you have a chance of getting better, right? I mean, like, I don't want to the extent that the placebo effect is me talking up, like, my confidence in what I do, then absolutely. Like, I mean, am I going to withhold that from my patients? There's no side effects to me saying, like, I believe this medicine is going to help you, right? But I don't, like, lie to them if I wouldn't give them a placebo and tell them it was a real treatment. But fortunately, since you can tell people that it's a placebo that you're giving them, it still works, then I don't need to do that.
Great, okay. Let's thank Dr. Toups and Dr. Jadu. Thank you so much. I can't resist the temptation to end with one story that's about this expectation error. So we teach our UT neuroscience majors about the dopamine system and expectation, and we teach them that when something unexpectedly good happens, the dopamine activity goes up, and when they're expecting something good that doesn't happen, dopamine neuron activity goes down. Now, we use this system called Canvas for all of our classes at UT. It's assignments and grades, and there's a chat board for people to ask questions. And one of the, what's the right word, morons in my class used the chat board right after learning about this dopamine neuron stuff, used the chat board to ask one of the TAs out on a date. And I just want to share with you her answer. Keeping in true TA spirit, she told him on the chat line, if you expect me to say yes, your dopamine neuron activity is going to go down. So thank you for being here. Thank you guys, you did a great job. Thank you so much. If you have more questions, if you think of one on the way home or tonight, email me. Do we have my? You can still text us to this. Okay, text it to this. My email address is mock@utexas.edu. Somehow get a question to us. We'll find a way to answer it. So thank you so much for being here, and hope to see you next time.